She had paid everything she owned to reach the West, and the men she trusted left her to freeze. Mei Lin lay dying in the snow of the Montana Territory, her legs shattered beneath her, her body failing degree by degree in a blizzard that showed no mercy. The guide she'd hired, Wade Holt, and his silent, stone-faced partner had stripped her of every coin, taken the jade pendant her mother once pressed into her palm, and left her crumpled against a boulder like something broken beyond worth. They hadn't looked back. Not once. No one was coming. No one even knew she was out here. Follow this story to the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind screamed across the high country like something alive tearing at the pines, driving snow in sheets so thick the world beyond 10 feet ceased to exist. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. Patient and absolute, it worked its way through wool and skin and bone until there was nothing left to fight back with. Mei Lin felt it winning. She had stopped trying to move her toes sometime in the last hour, or the hour before that. Time had become a strange elastic thing, stretching out between moments of sharp awareness and long gray stretches where her mind drifted to places far from this frozen ravine in the Montana high country. She tried to hold on to the sharp moments. She understood in some distant and clinical way that the drifting ones were more dangerous. Her leg lay at an angle that turned her stomach every time she made the mistake of looking at it. The femur had snapped clean when her mule stumbled in a hidden crevice the morning before, or the morning before that she could no longer be certain. The initial agony had been extraordinary, a white-hot bolt that had stolen her voice and her breath simultaneously. That screaming pain was gone now, replaced by something duller and more insidious, a deep pulsing ache that radiated upward with every heartbeat growing slower and heavier as her body exhausted its will to protest. She had used her traveling cloak to rig a crude windbreak between two boulders, jamming the corners into cracks in the rock with fingers she could no longer feel. It wasn't shelter, not really, just a slight reduction in the wind's assault, a narrow pocket of air that wasn't quite as murderous as everything beyond it. She had pulled her knees to her chest, or tried to her broken legs, screaming even at that small movement. She had pressed herself small against the stone. And then she had waited. She was still waiting. You didn't come this far to die in the snow. The thought surfaced through the fog, sharp and stubborn. She had carried it with her for 2 days, turning it over like a river stone in her palm, finding its edges worn smooth from repetition. She had come so far. From the Pearl River Delta across the Pacific in a ship's hold, packed so tightly she had slept sitting upright for 3 weeks. From the docks of San Francisco, where men with hard eyes had looked at her and seen nothing worth acknowledging. From the laundry on Sacramento Street, where steam burned her hands raw from dawn until dark, and the overseer docked her wages for every imagined infraction. 3 years of that life. 3 years of saving every dime she could scrape together in secret hiding coins in the lining of her coat, watching the small pile grow, with the patience of someone who had no other option. She had heard stories from other women in the boarding houses that the territory towns to the east were different. Smaller, less saturated with the particular cruelty that gathered in cities like sediment. That a woman with a strong back and a willingness to work might find something there that resembled dignity. She had believed those stories enough to act on them. And then Wade Holt had smiled at her across a tavern table and taken everything she had. She remembered his face clearly when her mule had gone down, that brief flicker of calculation, the rapid weighing of options that played out behind his pale eyes. She had been screaming from the pain before she'd even registered what was happening, her hands clawing at the snow-covered rocks trying to find purchase. Holt had dismounted. She'd thought for one desperate moment that he was going to help. Instead, he had knelt beside her fallen pack and begun going through it with methodical efficiency. His partner, a thin man whose name she'd never learned, had remained on horseback, watching with the blank expression of someone observing weather. Holt had found her money first, the coins she'd sewn into a pocket in the bottom of her travel bag. He'd held them up to the gray light and counted them with the satisfied nod of a man confirming his inventory. Then he'd found the pendant. The jade had been her mother's, small and cool, carved in the shape of a fish for luck, worn smooth from decades of handling. Her mother had pressed it into her hand on the dock in Guangzhou and told her to keep it close, that it would bring her home no matter how far she wandered. Holt had pocketed it without looking at her. She'll slow us down, he'd said to his partner, rising to his feet and brushing snow from his knees as casually as a man clearing crumbs from a dinner table. What about leave her? She had screamed after them. She had cursed them in Cantonese and in the broken English she'd learned from women at the laundry, and in every register of fury her voice could reach. She had called them cowards and thieves and worse. The snow swallowed her words. The snow swallowed everything. Within minutes, they were gone. That had been she, calculated dimly at least 30 hours ago, maybe more. She'd lost the ability to trust her sense of time somewhere in the night. She knew she'd been conscious for most of it, which struck her as either very good or very bad. She knew the sun had risen and set once since then, and was now somewhere behind the clouds to the west beginning its descent again. She knew she was in serious trouble. She knew no one was coming. The nearest town was 40 miles south. She had no way to reach it, no way to signal for help, no way to do anything except press herself against this boulder and wait for the cold to finish what Holt had started. She was just another nameless woman who had gambled everything on a dream and lost. The territory was full of people like her. It swallowed them without ceremony and moved on. I'm sorry, Mama. The thought surfaced gently without the anguish she might have expected. There was something almost peaceful about it, about the slow loosening of the knot she'd been carrying in her chest for years. I tried. The sound of hoofbeats didn't register as real at first. Her mind had been producing small hallucinations for the last few hours, fragments of sound and shape at the edges of her vision that dissolved when she turned toward them. The creak of a door that didn't exist. The smell of rice cooking somewhere distant. She had learned to let them pass without engaging, to hold on to the cold and the pain as anchors to what was real, even though she resented the anchors deeply. So when she heard the rhythm of hooves on frozen ground, she cataloged it and set it aside. But it didn't fade. It grew louder, and then it stopped. Christ. The voice was low and rough, stripped of everything except the observation. A man's voice. She turned her head with enormous effort, squinting through the gap in her cloak windbreak toward the world beyond. A horse stood in the snow 15 feet away, a stocky, buckskin mare with dark, intelligent eyes, and snow crusted along her neck and shoulders. On her back sat a rider broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy canvas coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over a face that was all angles and shadow in the flat winter light. He was looking directly at the boulder, looking directly at her. He dismounted before she'd fully processed that he was real. His boots crunched through the crust of ice on top of the snow. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury the wilderness didn't allow. He pulled the cloak aside without asking permission, and the gray daylight hit her face and made her wince. She stared up at him. He was younger than she'd expected from the voice, mid-30s maybe, though the face was weathered enough that it was hard to be certain. Several days' growth of dark beard, eyes the color of storm clouds before the lightning started. They moved over her with quick, clinical attention. Wrist, neck, face, leg. She instinctively pressed herself back against the stone, some animal part of her, recognizing that she was completely helpless. And this man was a stranger, and the world had given her every reason to be afraid of strangers. He either didn't notice or didn't care. He dropped to one knee in the snow and pressed two fingers against her wrist. "Can you hear me?" His voice was gravel and economy. She managed a nod. It took more effort than it should have. "Your leg." He was already examining it, not asking permission for that, either, his hands moving with careful efficiency along the line of the break. His jaw tightened at what he found. "How long have you been out here?" "A day." The words scraped out of her throat, dry and cracked. "Maybe two." Something moved across his face. Not pity, she'd been on the receiving end of enough pity in her life to recognize it, and this wasn't it. It was more like calculation, yes, but a different kind than Holt's. Like a man taking stock of what was in front of him and deciding what needed doing. She waited for him to stand, to walk back to his horse and ride away. Every reasonable impulse a person might have told him to do exactly that. The nearest town was 40 miles away. The weather was worsening, and she was a Chinese woman alone in a mountain ravine who had no claim on any stranger's time or risk. She was someone else's problem. She was frankly barely even a problem anymore, because problems implied possible solutions. He didn't stand. Instead, he reached back and pulled the coat from his own shoulders. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. She gasped involuntarily as the heavy canvas settled over her, trapping what little heat remained in her body and beginning cautiously to add to it. Her fingers tingled, then burned. Then worse than both, she began to feel her feet again, first as vague pressure, then as a hot grinding agony that made her vision swim. "Stay with me." His hand was on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "Don't pass out. I need you conscious." For what everyone, she could barely form the words. "Splint." He was already moving, scanning the immediate area, pulling rope from a coil on the mare's saddle. "Can't move you without one. That leg shifts wrong on the ride, you'll bleed out before we make it anywhere." Mei Lin stared at him. "You're helping me." He glanced back at her just briefly before returning his attention to a pair of broken branches he'd found half buried in the snow. He brushed them clean with quick, certain movements. "Looks that way." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He returned to her side, knelt, and positioned the branches against either side of her shattered femur with the confidence of a man who had done this before, possibly on himself, possibly on others. His hands were rough and calloused, but they moved with a gentleness she hadn't expected. "Because you're dying," he said finally. It wasn't an answer, not really, but he didn't offer anything else. She learned quickly that he hadn't been exaggerating about the pain of the splint. When he tightened the first wrap of rope around the branches and her broken leg, she screamed a raw animal sound that tore out of her throat before she could stop it, that echoed off the stone and got swallowed by the wind. He didn't flinch, didn't stop. "I know," he said. "Breathe through it." She tried. She focused on the sound of his breathing, steady, measured, utterly calm, and on the smell of leather and wood smoke that clung to the coat he draped over her, and on the mechanical precision of his movements, which left no space for drama or apology. Just the work. Just the next necessary thing. "Who are you?" she managed between breaths. "Ethan Cole." He finished the second wrap and checked the tension with a critical eye. "Names don't matter much right now. They matter to me." He looked at her, then briefly and fully, and something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a slight adjustment, like a man recalibrating. "Staying alive matters more," he said. "But all right, you've got a name. Mei Lin." "Mei Lin." He said it carefully, checking the pronunciation. "All right." He finished the splint and sat back to examine his work. Then he stood and moved to the horse, redistributing his gear blankets of bedroll supplies, packed into saddlebags to create space in the saddle. Mei Lin watched him through a haze of pain, still struggling to process the fact that this was real, that a stranger had appeared out of a blizzard and was preparing to carry her out of it. "Can you sit a horse?" he asked. "I can't stand." "That's what I figured." He came back to her and crouched down, and she saw on his face the moment he prepared himself for what came next. His expression went calm and deliberate. "This part," he said, "is going to be worse than the splint. I'm sorry." Before she could ask what he meant, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back and lifted. The world exploded. The pain was absolute, a tidal wave of white fire that wiped out every other sensation, every coherent thought, every instinct, except the screaming imperative of the body to stop, to cease, to go somewhere else. Mei Lin heard herself make a sound she didn't recognize, something beyond language. Her vision strobed. The mountains wheeled. The snow came up at her and then receded. "Breathe!" His voice was close to her ear, steady against the roaring in her head. "In and out. Stay with me. You can pass out after we start moving." "I can't." "You can. You survived 2 days in a blizzard with a shattered leg." There was something in his voice that wasn't quite gentleness, but served the same function, something firm and certain, something that left no room for doubt. "You can survive this." She breathed, in and out, one after another. The white subsided to gray, and the gray became the snow-covered ravine, and the ravine became the saddle beneath her, and the horse's warmth, and Ethan Cole's arm across her waist, keeping her from sliding sideways. "Hold the horn," he said. Her fingers found the worn leather of the saddle horn. She gripped it. "Good." He clicked his tongue, and the mare moved forward. The journey was a particular species of suffering Mei Lin had not previously encountered. Every step the horse took transmitted directly to her broken leg through the saddle, a constant jarring, grinding communication from bone to nerve to brain that never let her fully lose consciousness, but never let her fully retain it either. She existed in a narrow corridor between the two states where time had no reliable dimension and where the only constants were pain and cold, and the arm that tightened around her waist whenever she began to sag. She made sounds she couldn't control, small cries bitten off and involuntary that slipped past her defenses with each particularly rough step. She hated them. She pressed her lips together and focused on the rhythm of the horse's movement, tried to predict and brace for each impact, tried to find the pattern in it. Ethan never told her to be quiet. He adjusted his hold when she shifted. He murmured something low and continuous that she couldn't quite resolve into words over the wind, a sound more like tone than language, the kind of thing people said to horses in bad weather, and apparently to broken women on borrowed horses. It was not comforting exactly. It was steadying. Different thing. Time stopped meaning anything again. There was only the corridor of pain and cold and forward motion. Once she felt herself actually sliding her grip on the saddle horn, loosening the darkness at the edges of her vision, closing in. His arm tightened. Not yet. We're close. She didn't believe him, but she held on anyway. The cabin materialized through the snow, like something conjured a small, solid structure of rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney with a thin thread of smoke rising from it tucked against the base of a pine-covered ridge that blocked the worst of the wind. A woodpile under a lean-to on one side, a small outbuilding further back, a fence line barely visible beneath the snow. Real. It was real. It was. Mei Lin had been holding herself together with nothing but will for so long that the sight of it, the warmth promised by that thread of smoke, the solidity of walls and roof, caused something in her to simply let go. Not the consciousness, not yet, but the effort. The rigid maintenance of herself as a person with agency and independence and pride. She sagged against the arm that was holding her up and didn't resist it and let herself be carried the rest of the way. Ethan dismounted first, then lifted her down with the same careful practicality he'd shown throughout, absorbing her weight without complaint, adjusting his grip as she listed sideways. She had stopped being able to tell exactly where his arms were and where her own body ended. The cold had blurred those distinctions. She was simply aware of being held and of forward movement and of a door swinging open. The warmth was a physical impact. It hit her face and hands and lungs like something she'd forgotten was possible. Air that had temperature that wasn't trying to kill her, that smelled of pine smoke and leather and something savory from a pot hanging over the fireplace. Her body had a visceral, involuntary reaction to it, a kind of full system shudder that moved through her, from feet to scalp, as sensation began flooding back into places that had been numb for too long. He laid her on the bed against the far wall. The rough wool blanket was the most extraordinary thing she had ever felt. Mei Lin lay there and breathed and felt the pain in her leg asserting itself more loudly now that the cold was no longer competing with it, and watched through half-closed eyes as Ethan Cole moved through his cabin with quiet, purposeful efficiency, stoking the fire higher, filling a kettle from a barrel in the corner, pulling things from shelves, moving the way a man moved who had spent a long time doing everything himself and had found the rhythms of it. The cabin was spare, a table, 2 chairs, the bed she was on, shelves on one wall dense with supplies, dried provisions, tools, a medical kit of some kind, a rifle mounted above the door, a second rifle on a rack beside it. Everything functional, built for survival rather than comfort, but cared for. Clean, intentional. Stay awake a little longer. He was at the fire, hanging the kettle to boil, not looking at her. I need to check the leg, make sure the bone didn't shift. It shifted, she blessed. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and far away. Probably. He came and pulled up the chair and sat beside her, and his hands began the careful work of unwrapping the splint. Question is how much, in which direction? She gritted her teeth and let him work. His examination was thorough and unhurried. He checked the alignment of the break, the degree of swelling, the color of the skin above him and below the injury. His expression remained unreadable throughout, but she had already begun to learn his face well enough to see the slight tension around his jaw when he reached the worst of it. How bad? She asked. Bad enough. He began rewrapping with fresh cloth from a kit on the shelf beside the bed, tighter than before. Femurs fractured, compound break by the look of it, though I can't be certain without a proper doctor. The nearest one is in Redstone, 40 miles south. He tied off the wrap. Storm's going to keep that road closed for at least a week. So what do we do? Wait. Keep it immobilized, keep you warm, keep infection away, if we can. He met her eyes, and she saw in them the thing she had come to recognize as his particular form of honesty, the kind that didn't reach for comfort at the expense of truth. You're lucky the cold slowed the swelling, might have saved the leg, and if it gets infected anyway, then we deal with it. It wasn't reassurance, it was a statement of intent. Somehow that was better. He moved back to the fire and ladled hot water into a tin cup, adding something from a small cloth pouch. Herbs she didn't recognize, dark and pungent. He brought it to her without ceremony. Drink, it'll help with the pain. She took it with hands that shook only slightly less than they had before. The liquid was bitter and earthy and deeply strange, and the warmth of it spread through her chest and belly like a slow fire. And within minutes, the sharpest edges of the agony in her leg had begun to recede into something she could, if not ignore, at least exist alongside. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate, but she didn't have others. He had already turned away, moving through the cabin with his quiet evening routines, checking the door latch, adding wood to the fire, beginning some kind of meal from the provisions on the shelves. He didn't acknowledge the thanks, but she saw something shift slightly in the set of his shoulders. Not discomfort. Something more like the look of a man who has received something he doesn't quite know what to do with. Mei Lin watched him in the warm firelight and understood, with sudden and startling clarity, that she was not going to die tonight. The cold had lost its grip on her degree by degree as the fire's warmth reclaimed her limbs. The pain was still there, enormous and persistent, but it was survivable pain, the kind that meant the body was still fighting. She could work with survivable. She had been working with survivable her entire life. "Why did you help me?" she asked again when the silence had stretched long enough to feel like his own kind of answer. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had his back to her, standing at the fire, and he didn't turn. The flames threw his shadow long across the floor. "My wife died in the snow," he said. 5 years ago." Mei Lin said nothing. She waited. "Pneumonia." He set down whatever he'd been holding. "Came on fast. I was 20 miles out checking trap lines. By the time I came back, she was already gone." He paused. "Found her outside. She tried to get to town for help. Made it maybe a quarter mile before she fell." The fire crackled. Snow ticked against the shutters. "I told myself a lot of things after," he continued. "That it wasn't my fault. That I couldn't have known. That the weather would have killed me too if I'd been there." He turned then and looked at her, direct and unguarded in a way she suspected he rarely allowed himself. "None of it helped. So I made a promise to myself. If I ever found someone dying in the snow again, I wouldn't leave them. Wouldn't matter who they were. Wouldn't matter if it was smart or safe or convenient." The silence that followed had weight to it. Not uncomfortable, more like the silence after something true has been said, and the air needs a moment to accommodate it. "I'm sorry," Mei Lin said softly. "Don't be." He looked away. "It's not your burden." He moved to the shelf and resumed preparing the meal, and Mei Lin closed her eyes and breathed and felt the warmth working its way deeper into her bones, and thought about the woman she had been this morning, broken alone, absolutely certain she was going to die. And the woman she was now, alive and aching and sheltered in a stranger's cabin, because that stranger had made a promise to someone who was no longer around to know he was keeping it. There was something in that. Some meaning she couldn't quite find the shape of yet, but could feel pressing against the edge of her understanding like light under a door. She would think about it later. When she was warmer. When the herbs had done more of their work and the pain had stepped further back. For now she breathed and let the fire do what fire was for. She woke later to a cabin gone dark and quiet. The fire burned to orange embers, shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Pain pulsed in her leg with the rhythm of her heart, duller now, but constant, a reminder she wasn't out of the woods in any sense of the phrase. She tried to shift and gasped at the spike that followed. "Don't move." Ethan's voice came from the dimness. She turned her head and found him in one of the chairs beside the hearth, coat off, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows on his knees. He was staring at the embers, not sleeping, just sitting with the stillness of a man who had spent a long time alone and knew how to occupy quiet spaces. "How long?" she asked. "Few hours." He rose without hurry and moved to the fire, adding a log. Flames licked at the fresh wood and pushed back the shadows. "You need more, but you should eat first." The soup he brought her was venison and root vegetables, simple and dense, with the kind of nourishment her depleted body craved with something close to desperation. When her hands shook too badly to hold the bowl, he took it and the spoon without comment, and fed her with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he brought to everything else. No pity in his face, no discomfort, just the task. When she finished, he helped her lie back down. "Sleep," he said. "Where will you sleep?" He gestured to the chair. "Here." "That's not, I've slept in worse." He moved back toward the chair. "Don't worry about it." "I wasn't worried about your comfort," she said carefully. I was, I just wanted you to know that I don't." She stopped, started again. "I'm not afraid of you." He looked at her, then standing by the chair in the firelight, and she saw something move through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated than that. "You should be," he said. "You don't know me. I know you've had a dozen chances to hurt me and haven't." She held his gaze. "That's more than most men can say." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Get some rest, Mei Lin." She did. And this time warm-fed the herbs still working at the edges of her pain, sleep came easily. Without nightmares, without the creeping awareness of cold and dying that had haunted her for 2 days. Just sleep deep and dark and restorative, while the fire crackled in the Montana night, and outside the blizzard raged against the walls of the cabin, and inside the stubborn ember of her will to live burned steadier than it had in longer than she could remember. The fever came without warning on the 9th morning. Mei Lin woke from a dreamless sleep to find the cabin tilting the ceiling, doing slow circles above her head, the wool blanket beneath her soaked through with sweat despite the cold that still crept through the log walls. Her leg, which had been making cautious progress, the swelling gradually retreating under Ethan's twice-daily care, throbbed with a renewed viciousness that told her something had changed before she even pulled back the blanket to look. She knew it was bad before she saw it. She knew it from the heat radiating upward from the break site, from the way her skin felt too tight, from the particular character of the pain, which had shifted from the grinding mechanical agony of broken bone to something deeper and more systemic. Something wrong. "Ethan." Her voice came out as a croak. He was there in seconds, which told her he hadn't been asleep. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, and she saw the change in his expression, the quick tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes went somewhere internal for a half-second before coming back. "Damn it." He was already moving. He pulled back the splint wrapping with controlled urgency, and she heard the low curse that escaped him before he could stop it. Red streaks radiated from the break site up her thigh like cracks in dry earth. The skin around the injury was swollen tight and hot to the touch, an angry deep color she didn't need medical training to interpret. "How bad?" she managed. "Bad enough." He straightened and went for the shelves. "Should have anticipated this. Bone probably had contamination when it broke. Been working against us since the beginning." He set a pot of water to boil and began laying out supplies with the focused efficiency of a man running through a checklist in his head. "What I'm going to do is going to hurt. Worse than anything so far." Mei Lin swallowed. "How much worse?" His expression didn't change. "You'll find out." He wasn't exaggerating. When he cleaned the infected wound working with cloths and a solution from a brown bottle that smelled sharp and medicinal, Mei Lin screamed. There was no modulating it, no preparation that helped. The pain was simply beyond the scope of what the body had language for. She was aware of his hands steady and relentless, aware of pressure where there should have been nothing left to press, aware of something releasing that made the air in the cabin smell differently. "Stay with me." His voice cut through the white. "Tell me if you feel numbness, tingling that spreads. Everything as it all hurts. Different hurt. Numbness, not pain. Can you tell the difference?" She tried to catalog what she was feeling through the roaring of it. "Just pain. Everything is pain." "Good, that's good." He didn't stop working. "Pain means the nerves are intact." When he finished and rewrapped the wound tighter with fresh cloth secured with practiced knots, she couldn't have replicated. Mei Lin was shaking so violently the bed frame trembled. Tears had tracked down her temples into her hair, without her consciously knowing she was crying. She felt hollowed out, scoured like something had been removed, and the space hadn't filled back in yet. Ethan brought water. Small sips, he said. Then more of the bitter herbal tea, stronger this time, and a cool cloth pressed to her forehead that made her exhale a long breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. "Will I lose the leg?" she whispered. The pause before he answered told her more than the answer itself. "Don't know yet." He met her eyes without flinching. "The next 24 hours will tell." And if I do, then we figure out what comes after that. His voice was level without the false comfort that would have been worse than nothing. One problem at a time. She stared at the ceiling and felt the fever thickening around her thoughts, making the edges of things soft and uncertain. I don't want to be your second chance, she said, at saving someone. I don't want you to be doing this because of her. His jaw went hard. Too bad, that's what you are. Ethan, it doesn't make it less real. He stood moved to wet a fresh cloth. You're in that bed and you need help, and I'm here, and I'm giving it. The reason I'm capable of doing that, the reason I made myself learn what I know that came from Clara. But what's happening in this cabin right now is about you. You're not a substitute. You're Mei Lin. He came back and pressed the cool cloth to her neck. So stop arguing with me and let me work. She stopped arguing. The fever ran for 3 days. Mei Lin moved in and out of it like a tide, sometimes fully present, aware of the cabin and the fire in Ethan's hands and voice, and sometimes in other places entirely. On the ship from Canton, in the laundry, steam burning her eyes. Standing on the dock in Guangzhou, with her mother pressing the jade pendant into her palm, telling her the fish would find its way home, no matter how far the current carried it. Her brother thin and feverish in the hold of the ship, asking for water she didn't have. She was 12 years old and she couldn't save him. She was 23 years old and she couldn't save herself. She woke in the gray hours of what felt like the second night to find Ethan sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, pressing a cool cloth along the inside of her wrist anywhere. The blood ran close to the surface, anywhere the fever burned hottest. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He looked like he hadn't slept since before she'd gotten sick. The lines around his eyes cut deeper, the hollows of his face more pronounced. Am I dying? She whispered. Not if I can help it. Why do you care? She knew she was asking for something more than he'd given her before pushing at the sealed door of it. The fever made her less careful than she would otherwise have been. A promise to a ghost. That's not... She broke off coughing, and his arm was around her shoulders, helping her through it. He held water to her lips when the coughing subsided. She drank and tried again. You don't know me, she said. I'm nothing to you. You're a person. He set the cup down. You're suffering. That's enough. Is it enough for you? He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was lower. Maybe not most times. He wrung out the cloth in the basin and pressed it to her forehead. But it's enough right now. Lie still. She lay still. She watched the firelight move across the ceiling. She thought about what he'd said and what he hadn't said, and about the look on his face when she'd told him she didn't want to be his second chance. He hadn't been angry. He'd been something else, something that looked from the right angle like being seen. On the third morning the fever broke. Mei Lin became aware of it slowly. The cotton wrapping around her thoughts, thinning the ceiling, coming back into sharp relief, the sounds of the cabin resolving from formless noise into individual components. The fire, the wind outside, the sound of something boiling. She lifted a hand to her forehead and felt cool skin. Ethan was asleep at the table, his head resting on his folded arms, his breathing slow and even. He was still fully dressed. The dark circles under his closed eyes were deep enough to look like bruises. She reached over and touched his shoulder. He was awake and sitting upright before her hand had fully made contact. Old instincts, she thought, the kind built by years of solitude in a landscape that didn't give second chances. The fever's gone, she said. He pressed his palm to her forehead. She watched relief move across his face like weather and felt something shift in her chest at the sight of it, at the understanding of how much it had cost him these 3 days and how little he would ever say about that. The infection is retreating. He had unwrapped and checked the wound before she'd fully processed that he was moving. He rewrapped it with hands that shook very slightly from exhaustion. Not out of danger, still need to watch for complications, but the worst has passed. Mei Lin let out a long, slow breath. Her eyes stung. I thought I was going to die, she said. So did I. His voice was rough. For a while there. The admission sat between them more honest than most of the things they'd said to each other. She looked at him, this weathered, stubborn, bone-tired man who had sat up for 3 days fighting death on her behalf, and thought about all the things she didn't yet understand about him and all the things she already did. Ethan. Yeah. Thank you. A pause. Not for finding me. For the 3 days. He looked at her for a moment and then away. Don't thank me for doing what anyone should do. Most people wouldn't have. Then most people are wrong. He stood and moved to the fire. You need food, real food. She ate. Her body accepted it with a desperate, grateful efficiency. Ethan watched her from his chair with an expression she had begun to recognize, the one he wore when he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. He used it more often than she suspected he realized. What are you thinking about? She asked. Nothing useful. He refilled his coffee cup. Rest, don't try to move. Tomorrow we start figuring out what comes next. What does come next? He leaned back in his chair and looked at her over the rim of his cup. Healing. Then you tell me. She thought about the woman she'd been before Holt left her in the snow. Running from everything, running toward an imagined somewhere better. Measuring her progress in coins saved and miles put between herself and the life she couldn't bear anymore. No plan, no destination, really. Just a way. I don't know what I want, she said. I've known what I was running from for 3 years. I don't know yet what I'm running toward. Something in his face shifted, a recognition that went too deep to be comfortable. Yeah, he said quietly. I know that feeling. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the cabin walls, indifferent and absolute. But inside, the fire burned and Mei Lin was alive, and the man in the chair across from her had fought for 3 days to keep her that way. That for now was enough to build from. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its gentleness. Ethan rose before dawn as always, and stoked the fire before he did anything else. He made coffee that was strong enough to strip paint poured her cup first, without being asked or apparently noticing that he did it, and then proceeded through his morning checks. The weather, the wood supply, her leg. His hands on the wound each morning were the same, thorough, impersonal, focused entirely on the work. But she had begun to understand that impersonal wasn't the same as indifferent, and thorough wasn't the same as clinical. He was paying attention. He was always paying attention. Better, he said on the 7th day after the fever broke, rewrapping the splint with practiced precision. Bruising starting to fade, swellings down significantly. He sat back in the chair. Another week, maybe 2, you might be able to put a little weight on it. And then, he looked at her steadily, and then we figure out what comes next. He kept saying that, we figure out what comes next, like it was a given that the figuring would be done together. Like she was already in some unspoken way part of the equation. She spent her days watching him work and asking him questions. She had decided early in her recovery that this was the most useful thing she could do from the bed, not simply occupying space but learning. He was a teacher who didn't know he was teaching, which was, she'd found, often the best kind. She learned that he had grown up in these mountains, his father, a French-Canadian fur trapper, who had taught him the land the way other fathers taught arithmetic, through repetition, correction, and occasional punishment for carelessness. She learned that he had tried to be someone different after Clara had left the mountains and taken work in town, and lasted 3 months before the press of people and the weight of their sympathy had driven him back. She learned that he trapped more than he needed and traded the surplus in redstone twice a season, that he had read every book on his shelf at least 4 times, that he carved wood in the evenings with a small knife and produced objects of surprising delicacy, a bird here, a horse there, which he left on whatever flat surface was nearest and seemed to forget about entirely. What she was learning, beneath all the practical information, was something harder to name: the shape of a person, the particular contours of someone's solitude. You're studying me, he said one afternoon, not looking up from the harness he was mending. I'm learning from you. There's a difference. He glanced up, and she saw the ghost of something that might in another man have become a smile. It retreated before it fully formed. You've got a sharp tongue. I've been told. She shifted against the pillows, her leg protesting the movement in a way that was irritating but manageable. She was learning its language, learning the difference between the pain that meant damage and the pain that meant progress. My mother used to say I asked too many questions. She was right. She was usually right. A pause. She died when I was 14. Fever. I didn't have a father. He went back to Guangdong before I was born. After my mother died, there was only my brother and me for a while, and then she stopped. Old grief worn smooth like the river stones she'd imagined turning over in her mind, but still present, still waited. And then, he asked, quietly, not pushing, offering a door if she wanted to walk through it. He died on the ship coming over. I told you. She looked at the fire. I was 12 when that happened. The ship death, not my mother. They're different griefs. The ship one I never really sat with, there wasn't time. There was only arriving and surviving and doing what needed doing. You've been doing what needed doing for a long time. I don't know how to stop. The words came out without her intending them with a rawness that made the air in the cabin feel briefly charged. She felt his attention on her, that particular quality of focus he had, like a man reading weather. Neither do I, he said, after a moment. Maybe that's not the worst thing. She looked at him. He had gone back to the harness, his hands moving with their usual sure efficiency. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, some small giving in the line of them, that she had come to recognize as the closest he got to being open. Ethan, she said. Yeah. Why do you still live out here alone? He was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped and settled. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant conversation. I came back after Clara because I didn't know where else to go, he said. At first, and then I stayed because... He put down the harness, rubbed his hands on his thighs. Because out here I can pretend the isolation is a choice. That I stay because I want this, not because I can't face what's waiting for me in town. What's waiting in town? Memories. Every street corner she ever walked on. People who knew us together who look at me and see the before and after. His voice went flat in the way she'd learned meant he was pressing hard on something that pressed back. And all the questions. People asking how I'm doing, meaning, are you better yet, meaning, haven't you moved on, meaning, when are you going to stop making us uncomfortable with your grief? People mean well. People mean themselves. He picked the harness back up. Out here, nobody means anything at me. I can just be. Mei Lin thought about that, about the different kinds of loneliness. The kind that was imposed from outside, the isolation of being visible, and dismissed at the same time of being seen only as category, as labor, as problem. And the kind that was built from the inside, brick by careful brick, as protection against a world that had proved itself capable of taking the things you loved. I understand that, she said, the needing to just be, without someone deciding who you are before you've had the chance to decide yourself. He looked at her. It was the look he gave her sometimes when she said something that landed somewhere he hadn't expected. Not surprise exactly, but something recalibrated. Yeah, he said quietly. You do understand that. They sat in a silence that had become by then entirely comfortable. The afternoon light shifted. The fire needed another log. He added one without getting up, entirely with the easy efficiency of a man who'd tended this same fire for years. What did she look like? Mei Lin asked. Clara. Another person might have tensed at the question. Ethan just stilled for a moment, then continued what he was doing. Brown hair, he said. Green eyes. Freckles across her nose that she hated. A pause that wasn't painful, just thoughtful. She laughed a lot, more than the situation usually called for. She thought most things were funnier than they were. He stopped. It made everything feel easier than it was. You miss the laughter. I miss having a reason to make one. He set the harness aside and looked at her directly with the discomfort of someone who has said more than they intended and has decided this once not to take it back. Miss having someone around who made jokes and expected jokes back, who wanted... He stopped again. I miss it, that's all. I know, Mei Lin said. She thought of her mother's laugh, which had been loud and undignified and wonderful, and which she heard sometimes in the echo of her own. I know what it is to miss a voice. He nodded once, looked at the fire, then after a moment looked back at her. You should sleep, he said. She didn't argue, but before she closed her eyes, she said, Ethan, stop sleeping in that chair. He started to protest. I'm not afraid of you, she said for the second time. And there's room, and you look like a man who hasn't slept properly in 3 weeks. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not asking for anything. I'm asking you to sleep horizontally. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then, there are lines I'm not going to cross with you, Mei Lin. I know that, she said. I wasn't asking you to cross any of them. I was asking you to take care of yourself the same way you'd take care of everything else in this cabin. A pause. You taught me that the body needs what it needs. No point in being stubborn about it. Something moved through his expression. Not quite surrender. Closer to a man recognizing his own argument being turned back on him. I'll keep to my side, he said finally. I know you will. He did. And Mei Lin, who had spent years learning to sleep light and watchful, slept deeply for the first time since she could remember. The warmth and steadiness of another person's presence in the dark, more powerful than she would have predicted, more necessary than she would have been willing to admit. Outside, the Montana winter pressed on, but something in the cabin had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to if asked, just a degree or two warmer than it had been before. The slow, cautious beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. 10 days after the fever broke, Mei Lin walked across the cabin without the crutch. It wasn't graceful. Her atrophied leg burned with every step, the muscles having forgotten their function during the weeks of immobility, and she had to grip the edge of the table halfway across to keep from going down. But she made it to the opposite wall and back without falling, and when she turned, breathing hard from an effort that would have been nothing 3 months ago, Ethan was watching her from the doorway with an expression of careful assessment. Again, he said, I just did it. Do it again. Pain is information. I need to see how you move on the second pass. She did it again. The second time was marginally worse, the muscles protesting the novel demand with pointed messages. But the leg held. Compensating on the left hip, he said. That'll be a problem over distance. You'll need to consciously correct it or you'll throw your back out within a week of doing any real work. How do I correct it? He crossed the cabinet and positioned himself beside her, not quite touching, and demonstrated the correct posture and gait with the unhurried patience she had come to expect from him. She copied it. He adjusted a brief practical touch on her shoulder, her hip never lingering. She copied again. Better, he said. Better was his highest register of praise. She had learned to calibrate her expectations accordingly. The goal he'd set was a mile without the crutch. He'd marked the distance in the snow when the latest blizzard broke a long marker from the cabin to a distinctive, double-trunked pine that stood at the edge of the tree line, and told her she had to make that distance and back before he would take her out on the trap lines. It was, she understood, both a medical benchmark and something else, a test of a different kind. She suspected he was watching not just for whether her leg could do it, but for whether she was the kind of person who would push through when it hurt. She was. She made the mile on the 11th day. It took her 47 minutes and cost her a level of effort that she found slightly humiliating, given that it was simply walking, but she made it there and back without stopping, and when she reached the cabin door, she was shaking and sweating and entirely certain she wanted to do it again tomorrow. Ethan looked at her feet when she came in. The gait compensation, he said, mostly corrected by the halfway point. Mostly. I'm working on it. He nodded, poured her coffee. Tomorrow then, he said, we go to the first trap. She was awake before dawn. The world outside was blue dark and absolutely still, the way the high country sometimes went between storms, a suspended quality to the air, as though the land was holding its breath. Their breath formed clouds as they moved through the deep snow, Ethan breaking trail ahead of her on snowshoes, the rhythm of it strange and wide-legged and eventually intuitive, as most things were with enough repetition. He showed her how to read the land in the early morning when the light was low and the shadows were long, and the smallest variations in the snow's surface told stories. Here, a field mouse had crossed overnight. See the paired impressions, the distance between strides. Here, something larger had moved along the creek bank, pausing at a likely fishing spot. Here, the snow crust was broken in a way that suggested a deer bed recently vacated. You're not just reading tracks, she said, watching him study an area of disturbed snow near a fallen log. You're reading intention, he said. Yeah, what the animal was doing, why it was there, where it was going, where it's likely to be now. He straightened and looked into the tree line with the focused distance of a man seeing something beyond the visible. Trapping is mostly anticipation. You don't catch what's there. You catch what's going to be there in 3 hours when the light changes and the temperature drops and the hunger gets strong enough. How do you know what they'll do? You study them long enough, you start to understand the patterns. Same as anything with a nature. He moved toward the first trap site. Same as people. The first trap held a marten, small, dense-furred, the winter coat in excellent condition. Ethan removed it from the trap with clean efficiency, and Mei Lin watched his hands and the particular quality of his attention, respectful, she thought. Not sentimental, respectful. He reset the trap and showed her how the mechanism, the trigger, tension, the placement of bait in relation to the jaws. He made her do it twice. The second time she got the trigger tension right, and he didn't correct her. Good, Hurin, he said. They worked through 4 more traps over the next 2 hours, checking, resetting, reading the terrain around each one for signs of competition. Other trappers, scavengers, the evidence of animals too smart or too cautious to have been caught yet. At one location, he found the trap had been disturbed without triggering. Wolf, he said, studying the prints around the site. Smart one. Came in from upwind, got close enough to smell the bait, decided against it. He looked at the surrounding snow with something like appreciation. Same wolf has avoided 2 of my traps all season. I've started setting traps specifically for the pattern, trying to anticipate where she'll go to avoid the ones she knows about. She Tracks are too small for a male, and they're leading consistently back and toward the same direction, northeast ridge. Female probably denning up there. He glanced at Mei Lin. I'm not going to catch her. She's too clever. But I'd like to know if I'm right about where she is. Why? Because I've been watching her tracks for 3 months, and she's interesting. He said it flatly without apparent self-consciousness, and it was one of the most revealing things he'd told her about himself. He was interested in things. The intelligence beneath the isolation ran deep and quiet like cold water under ice, rarely visible, yet always present. On the walk back, with the light going golden and long across the snow, she asked, "What happened with your father?" "Heart," he said, "6 years ago, went fast." "Were you with him?" A pause. "No, I was checking trap lines." Something in his voice went carefully level. "Seems to be a pattern with me." "Ethan, I'm not looking for absolution." He kept walking, his voice matter of fact in the way she'd learned meant he was protecting something. "Just stating a fact. The people I love have a habit of dying when I'm not there. That's not a pattern. That's coincidence, and your refusal to forgive yourself." He glanced back at her. "You're doing it again." "What?" "Saying things that are right when I'd prefer you were wrong." She caught up with him. "That's a very long way of saying I'm right." The ghost smile again, gone before it fully arrived. "Don't push it." They walked in silence for a while. The snow crunched beneath their snowshoes. The pine trees threw long shadows. In the distance, something bird-shaped crossed the sky and vanished. "Tell me about Clara," she said. A longer pause this time. He weighed the request visibly, and she let him weigh it and didn't push. "She wanted a house in town," he said finally. "A real house, not this." He gestured at the wilderness around them without looking at it. "Neighbors, a garden, rooms with curtains." A pause. "I kept promising her someday and meaning it, but I was so sure we had time. That she'd get used to the mountains eventually. That the life I wanted was compatible with the life she needed." He stopped walking and stood still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. "We argued about it the morning she died. I left angry and stayed out an extra day to prove a point." Mei Lin said nothing. She had learned that he needed the space between sentences. "I found her 300 yards from the cabin," he said. "She'd tried to walk to the Hendersons' nearest neighbors 7 miles south when the fever came and I wasn't there. She made it to the tree line. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere distant, a branch cracked under ice weight. You've been punishing yourself for 5 years, she said quietly. I've been living with what I did. Those aren't the same thing." He turned and looked at her, and she saw it fully for the first time, not just the grief which she'd seen from the beginning, but the architecture of it. The way it had been built into a structure, load-bearing, holding everything else up. He didn't know who he was without it. He'd lived inside it long enough that it had become the shape of him. "Ethan." She moved a few steps closer through the snow. "You were not responsible for her death. You were a man who made an ordinary mistake, and the universe handed you an extraordinary consequence. That's not justice. That's not punishment fitting crime. That's just how things are sometimes, and pretending otherwise." She stopped and steadied herself on her bad leg. "Pretending otherwise doesn't bring her back. It just takes you with her. And that's not something I'm willing to watch happen." He stared at her. His breath came out in a long, slow cloud. "You're not in a position to watch anything," he said. "You're still on a crutch half the time. And yet here I am." She held his gaze. "Walking a mile through the snow to tell you to stop dying slowly." The silence stretched between them, long and breakable. She waited. He looked away, looked back. Then so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the wind. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been." I know. She did know. She had her own architecture, her own load-bearing grief. You start with one day, just one day where you try to carry it differently. Not put it down, just carry it different. He was quiet for a long time after that. They walked back to the cabin as the sun finished its descent behind the ridge, the sky going rose and violet above the pines. Neither of them spoke. But when they came through the door and he started the fire, and she sat in the chair that had gradually become her chair, something in the room was slightly different, the same incremental shift she'd noticed before, the temperature rising by another degree in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. He made dinner. She helped where she could, chopping dried vegetables, keeping the broth stirred, and they worked in the easy parallel silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill every moment with speech. After dinner, he sat by the fire with his carving knife and a piece of pine that was slowly becoming something small and four-legged. She mended a pair of his trail pants with stitches that were, she was pleased to note, markedly better than her first attempts. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, teach me to shoot. A real gun, not just dry firing." He looked up. "Your leg isn't ready for the recoil." "My leg is fine. I walked a mile today." "Walking and managing rifle recoil are different things." "Then teach me to manage recoil." She kept her voice level. "I'm not asking to hunt yet. I'm asking to know how. I'm asking to not be helpless." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he set down the carving and looked at the rifle on the wall. "Revolver first," he said. "Easier to control. We'll work up." "When fire?" "Tomorrow." She nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me until you fired it. You might hate it." She thought about Wade Holt kicking through her belongings with a boot and pocketing her mother's pendant. She thought about being left in the snow. "I won't hate it," she said. She didn't. The revolver was heavier than it looked, and the trigger pull was longer and stiffer than the dry fire drills had prepared her for. And the first time she actually fired it, she flinched so badly that the shot went wild, and Ethan told her to breathe and try again. By the fifth round, she was hitting the target, a line of pine cones balanced on a fence post, with enough consistency that he made a sound she'd learned to interpret as approval. "Flinch is mostly about anticipation," he said, standing slightly behind her, watching her grip and stance. "You're thinking about the bang before it happens. Stop thinking about what the gun's going to do and focus on what you want it to do." That's counterintuitive. Most true things are. She fired again. The pine cone on the left exploded. "Better," he said. Over the following days, they worked at it in the afternoons when her leg had been exercised and rested and was capable of maintaining stable stance. He was a good teacher, patient, precise, not inclined toward the kind of false encouragement that would let her practice mistakes instead of correcting them. He told her what she was doing wrong with the directness she'd come to expect and appreciate, and when she did something right, he said so with the same economy, and she found that economy more motivating than praise would have been. She shot the revolver until her hand cramped, and her aim was reliable enough to hit a tin can in at 30 feet on a moving hand. He moved her to the shotgun. The recoil slammed her the first time hard enough to step her backward, and he caught her arm. "Brace," he said. "Lean into it. Don't be surprised by what you already know is coming." Easier said, so most things are. But there was something in his face, not a smile, but the precondition of one, the way certain landscapes looked right before weather changed. Again, she braced, leaned in. The recoil hit, and she absorbed it and stayed upright, and when the smoke cleared, the tin can was simply gone. The expression on Ethan's face in that moment was something she kept after. It was the look of a man who had decided not to be surprised and was surprised anyway, not at what she'd done, but at how glad it made him. "Again," he said, but his voice had a different texture. She shot it again. On the 16th day after the fever, they went out on the trap lines in the morning, and in the afternoon they came back and found horse tracks circling the cabin. Ethan saw them first. He stopped so abruptly that Mei Lin almost walked into him, and she followed his eyes to the impressions in the snow, large, unshod, fresh. Circling the cabin twice, pausing at the door, then leading south back into the trees. His hand went to the rifle. "How old?" she asked quietly. "An hour, maybe two." He scanned the tree line, his expression gone completely closed and watchful. "Unshod horse out here is unusual. Could be someone who lost a mount, could be a prospector cutting through." He paused. "Could be someone who heard something they shouldn't have. About me, He didn't answer directly, which was its own answer. I need to go to Redstone, he said. Sell those pelts, get supplies, and find out what's being said in town. Mei Lin's stomach dropped. When? Tomorrow. He moved toward the cabin door, rifle still in hand. I'll be back in 2 days. 3 at the outside if the weather turns. She followed him inside. I'll be all right. You'll be careful, he said. The correction pointed. There's a difference. He went to the rack and took down the shotgun, checked the chamber, handed it to her without preamble. You know what to do with this. I know. I mean it, Mei Lin. He waited until she looked at him. Anyone comes to that door who isn't me, you don't open it. And if they try to force it, I know, she said again. You sure, Karim? She thought of the pine cone exploding from the fence post. She thought of everything she'd survived to be standing in this cabin. I'm sure. He spent that evening preparing for the trip and preparing her for his absence with equal care, checking supplies, going over the fire management twice, showing her once more where he kept the spare ammunition. He wrote a letter at the table by firelight, his penmanship careful and deliberate, and folded it and gave it to her along with a small leather pouch. If anything happens, he said, nothing's going to happen. If it does, he pushed the pouch toward her. Money enough for a stage. The letter names you as under my protection. It won't carry weight everywhere, but in Elk Ridge, there's a marshal named Ray Dunbar who knows my name and will honor it. You ride south, follow the creek, and you go to him. She looked at the letter, his name signed at the bottom in the same careful, deliberate hand. You're being very thorough, she said. I'm being prepared. He met her eyes. I'll come back, Mei Lin. I'm just making sure you have options if the world decides to be difficult in the meantime. She folded the letter and put it with the pouch inside her shirt against her chest where she could feel the weight of it. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he confirmed, and left before dawn. The first day alone, she managed well enough. She kept herself busy, kept herself careful, kept the shotgun close, and her ears open. The silence of the cabin was different without him, larger, less friendly, but she was not a woman who fell apart in silence. She had lived in worse silences than this. The second day was harder. By afternoon, the cabin felt like the inside of a held breath. She had done everything that could be done. She had checked the window and the door latch 11 times. She had practiced her aim until her shoulder ached. She had mended every piece of clothing in the cabin and started carving badly at a scrap piece of pine and given up and stared at the fire for an hour. She was standing at the window watching the tree line when she heard them. Voices. Men's voices, coming from the south, growing closer. Her hand found the shotgun before she had consciously decided to reach for it. Through the window, she watched 2 riders emerge from the tree line, then a third. They moved without urgency, following the horse tracks that already circled the cabin, following her trail. One of them turned his head toward the building, and even at distance, even through failing afternoon light, she recognized the set of those shoulders. Wade Holt. The cold that moved through her was different from the cold of the blizzard. The blizzard had been indifferent. This was intentional. She moved to the back of the cabin, pressed herself against the wall beside the door, and checked the shotgun. Loaded. Both barrels. She checked it again anyway. I know you're in there, Holt's voice carrying clearly across the snow. Smoke from the chimney, fresh tracks around the cabin. A pause. Come on out, girl. We just want to talk. She said nothing. She ain't going to answer, one of the other men said. Don't need her to answer. Holt again, his voice moving closer. Just need her to open the door. The door latch rattled, then a boot against the wood, hard and deliberate. Mei Lin raised the shotgun and aimed at the center of the door. She thought Ethan's voice. Breathe, don't anticipate. Focus on what you want, not what's happening. She thought he left her in the snow. He took my mother's pendant. She thought I didn't survive all of this to stop now. The door burst open. Wade Holt stepped through with his hand on his pistol, his eyes scanning the dim interior, and found Mei Lin standing 8 feet away with both barrels of a 12-gauge leveled at his chest. To his credit, he stopped. Well, he said, and the surprise in his voice was genuine. Then the calculation came back, a familiar weighing behind his pale eyes. You're not going to shoot me. Tell me why not, she said. Because you're not that kind of person. I was left to die in the snow, she said. Her voice was very steady. I survived 2 days in a blizzard with a broken leg. I survived infection. I learned to shoot. She held his gaze. You made me this kind of person. You and nobody else. Holt's hand was still on his pistol. She could see the calculation running the math of whether she would really fire, whether he could clear the gun from the holster before she pulled the trigger. He was trying to read her the way he'd read her on the mountain road, trying to find the seam of weakness to push through. She didn't give him one. "Get out," she said. "Take your men and get out. Tell them to leave the same way they came in. And if I don't, then I stop aiming at your chest." Holt went very still. "Your choice," she said. "You've got 5 seconds." He chose. He backed out slowly, holding her gaze, his hands rising to where she could see them. She followed him to the doorway and watched him mount up and gesture to the other two men, her fingers still on the trigger guard, her aim not wavering. She watched them until the trees swallowed them. She listened until the hoofbeats faded. Then she lowered the shotgun and sat down on the cabin floor, and her hands started shaking so badly she had to put the gun down, and she sat there on the floor of Ethan Cole's cabin with her back against the wall and let her body have its moment. She was still sitting there a half-hour later when she heard a horse approaching from the south. She picked up the shotgun, but the voice that came through the door before it opened was familiar. "Mei Lin, it's me." Ethan came in and found her on the floor, and his face did several things in quick succession. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, hands on her shoulders, and looked at her face. "What happened?" she told him, all of it flat and factual the way he'd taught her to observe. When she finished, his expression was completely still. "How many?" he said. "3. Holt and 2 others I didn't recognize." "Are you hurt?" "No. Are you sure?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "I'm not hurt, Ethan. I'm angry." Something moved across his face. It might have been relief, and it might have been something else entirely. "You held them off," he said. "I pointed a shotgun at Holt's chest and told him to leave." "Did he believe you'd fire?" She thought about it. He decided not to find out. Ethan sat back on his heels and was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was processing something. Then quietly, "You know this isn't over." "I know. Holt's not the type to let this go. He'll know you're here now that you survived, that you can identify him. He'll come back with more men and better preparation." "I know that too." "So," he held her gaze, "what do you want to do about it?" She had thought about this sitting on the floor in the long 30 minutes between Holt riding away and Ethan coming through the door. She had thought about it carefully. "I want to put it on record," she said, "everything. The robbery, the abandonment, what he said about the others." She watched his face. "You told me there's a marshal in Redstone. I want to testify." Ethan nodded slowly. "That means going to town, being visible, becoming a target in a public way." "I'm already a target." She stood up, her legs steadier than they'd been. "Being a hidden target doesn't work in my favor. Being a public one at least means someone knows where I am." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the war in him, the protective instinct pulling against the recognition that she was right, that running or hiding was no kind of life. "All right," he said. He pulled her into his arms before she could say anything else, not tentative, not careful, just present and solid, and she held on for a moment that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with what it meant to have someone to hold on to. "We leave at dawn," he said into her hair. "I'll be ready," she said. She was. Redstone materialized through the pre-dawn dark like a fever dream of civilization. The smell of coal smoke and horse manure, the faint glow of lanterns in upper windows, the sound of boots on boardwalks, and a dog barking somewhere on the edge of town. After weeks in the mountains, Mei Lin found the density of it disorienting. People everywhere are the evidence of them, wheels in the mud, voices from buildings. The layered evidence of 100 different lives being lived in close proximity. Ethan rode with his coat open, despite the cold, which she'd learned meant his hand needed quick access to the rifle slung across his saddle. "Marshal's office first," he said quietly as the mare picked her way down the main street. "Before Holt knows we're here." Marshal Ray Dunbar was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with gray salted hair and the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough over his career to stop being startled by most things. He looked up from a report when they came in, and his eyes moved from Ethan to Mei Lin to the set of Ethan's jaw, and he put the report down. "Cole," he said, "didn't expect you until spring. Change of circumstances." Ethan closed the door behind them. "She needs to file a formal complaint. Theft, criminal, abandonment, and attempted murder against Wade Holt." Dunbar's expression shifted, not surprise, but the controlled sharpening of attention. "Holt?" "You know the name," Mei Lin said. "Yeah, I know the name." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down, tell me everything. Start at the beginning. She did. She had rehearsed it on the ride down not to make it smoother or more persuasive, but to make it accurate. The facts in the correct order, every detail she could recall, nothing embellished and nothing minimized. She told him about the payment, the mountain road, the fall, Holt going through her pack, the pendant, she'll slow us down. She told him about the cold and the 2 days and Ethan finding her. She told him about the cabin, the recovery, the infection. She told him about Holt returning, the door kicked, and the shotgun. Dunbar listened without interrupting, making notes in a small leather book, his face giving nothing away. When she finished, he looked at Ethan. You corroborate this. Every part I was present for, Ethan said. I found her in the ravine-shattered leg, hypothermic, 2 days out. The infection was consistent with a contaminated compound fracture. Holt's tracks around the cabin matched his horse. I know that horse's gait from Trading Post. He paused, and I heard him through the door at the boarding house yesterday. What boarding house? We came to town yesterday afternoon. I wanted to get the lay of things before bringing her in. He glanced at Mei Lin briefly. We stayed the night at Fong's. Holt came around after dark. I heard him in the street through the window. Dunbar set down his pen. What did he say? Ethan's voice went flat. That he'd killed a dozen like her. That nobody looked for them. That nobody cared. The silence in the small office was the particular kind that followed the naming of something that had been present but unspoken for a long time. He wasn't the only one, Dunbar said quietly. I've had 7 complaints in 18 months. All Chinese workers. All claiming Holt took their money and left them in the backcountry. None of them were ever found. He looked at Mei Lin directly for the first time with something she hadn't expected from a man in his position, a frank, unguarded acknowledgement. You're the first one who made it back. I know, she said. That makes you important. He picked up his pen again, and dangerous to him. I want you to understand what you're agreeing to. Filing this complaint puts you in front of a judge. Holt's going to have a lawyer. That lawyer is going to try to discredit you. He paused. He's going to use your background. I know that too. And you're still willing to testify. I am, she said, because if I'm not, he keeps going. And the next woman he leaves in the snow doesn't have an Ethan Cole riding by. Dunbar looked at her for a moment. Then, I'll have a warrant issued by noon. The news that Mei Lin had filed charges against Wade Holt moved through Redstone the way news moved through small towns, faster than the people who carried it and altered in transit. By the time she and Ethan reached Mrs. Fong's boarding house for breakfast, the version circulating involved a gang of Chinese bandits, a disputed mining claim, and 3 dead horses. Mrs. Fong, who had the kind of face that had long since stopped apologizing for what it observed, set coffee in front of them both and said, half this town's going to think you're a criminal by afternoon. The other half, Mei Lin said. The other half doesn't care either way, which is almost worse. She poured her own cup and sat down. Holt's got friends here. Men who've used his guiding services, men who owe him favors, men who generally agree that Chinese workers are a category of problem rather than a category of people. She looked at Mei Lin without softness, but also without cruelty, the look of someone delivering a weather report rather than a judgment. I'm not saying any of that is right. I'm saying know what you're walking into. I know, Mei Lin said. Do you? Mrs. Fong's eyes moved to Ethan. And you understand what standing beside her in that courtroom is going to cost you. This town already thinks you're half mad. After this, you'll be the hermit who took in a Chinese girl and helped her make accusations against a respected guide. Holt's not respected, Ethan said. He's feared. There's a difference. Not to the men who profit from the arrangement. He looked at her steadily. I know what I'm doing. Good. She stood up. Then eat something. You both look like you've been living on spite and altitude. They ate. Around them, the boarding house came to life, other residents moving through for breakfast, glances sliding toward their table and away again, and the temperature of the room doing small, adjustable things based on who was looking and how. Mei Lin had spent her entire life in rooms like this, learning to take the measure of atmosphere the way Ethan took the measure of weather. She was not frightened. She was watching. The hearing was the next morning. Judge Roland Payne, not Hawkins, as they'd been told initially, that man, having retired with poor health, was a compact, precise man with a reputation for impatience and an eye for what people weren't saying. His courtroom in the back of what appeared to be a former grain warehouse was packed to its rough-hewn walls by the time Mei Lin arrived with Ethan on one side and Marshall Dunbar on the other. She had expected to be frightened. Instead, she felt clear. Everything in her life that had been unclear, her direction, her purpose, the question of what she was and who she was becoming, had been slowly resolving over the past weeks. And this morning it was sharper than it had ever been. She was someone who had been left to down and had refused the invitation. She was someone who had learned to shoot and walk through mountains and read the weather and set traps and sit with grief without being consumed by it. She was someone who could stand in a room full of people who wished she wasn't there and tell the truth anyway. Wade Holt sat at the front with his lawyer, a thin, well-dressed man named Sayers, who had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the cleverest person in any given room. Holt's leg was bandaged and visible. He'd made sure of that. He looked at Mei Lin when she came in with the calculated blankness of a man performing neutrality, and she looked back without expression. Dunbar presented the complaint. Sayers objected to the characterization, the sources, the reliability of the witnesses, the jurisdiction. The judge cut him off twice with brisk, precisely worded redirections. He had clearly heard this performance before. "Miss," he said when the preliminary motions had run their course, "tell me in your own words what happened." She did. The same words she'd used with Dunbar, the same order, the same unflinching accuracy. She was aware of the room as she spoke, the shifting of weight, the small sounds of reaction, the particular silence of people deciding whether to believe something. She kept her eyes on the judge and did not deviate and did not perform. Sayers cross-examined with the precision of a man removing screws. He questioned her memory, her character, her presence in the territory at all, her living arrangement with Ethan, her financial situation, her motives. He was good at it. He had a gift for questions that weren't questions, statements folded into interrogatives, each one designed to plant something in the room's collective mind without technically asserting it. She answered each one directly, without elaboration, without defensiveness. Yes, she had been living in Cole's cabin. Yes, they were not married. No, she had not been working in any official capacity. Yes, she had shot Holt through the door of the cabin. "So you admit to shooting my client," Sayers said. "Through a door he was in the process of kicking in," she said. "Yes. You can't be certain of his intentions." "He told me his intentions. He said, and I quote as precisely as I can, 'I killed a dozen of your kind, and nobody cared.'" She paused. "I considered those his intentions." The room was very quiet. Sayers pivoted. He tried a new angle: character, credibility, the unreliability of memory under stress. He tried to suggest that Ethan's testimony was compromised by personal attachment. He tried to paint a picture of Holt as a businessman wrongly accused by a woman with reasons to lie. He was good, but the room had heard what the room had heard. When it was Ethan's turn, he testified with the compact, precise clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime observing details and cataloging them accurately. He described finding Mei Lin, the condition of her leg, the evidence of contamination, the timeline of her recovery. He described the tracks at the cabin consistent with Holt's horse. He described what he had heard through the boarding house window. "You're certain of what you heard?" the judge asked. "I've spent 20 years learning to listen to things I can't see," Ethan said. "I'm certain." Mrs. Fong testified to what she'd heard on her staircase. Her voice was dry and unwavering, and she looked at Holt's lawyer the way she looked at most things, with a flat precision that discouraged certain kinds of enterprise. Dunbar testified, last summarizing the pattern of complaints. 7 workers, 7 disappearances, 1 survivor. The judge removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his handkerchief. This, Mei Lin had learned from a whispered comment by Dunbar's deputy, meant he was about to rule. "Mr. Sayers," he said, replacing the spectacles, "I've been on this bench for 17 years. I've heard a great many arguments. Yours today have the particular quality of arguments made in the defense of a position that cannot be defended on merit and must therefore be defended on procedure." He picked up his gavel. "Warrant is issued. Mr. Holt will be remanded to custody pending trial on all 3 counts. Bail is denied given the nature of the allegations and the evidence of prior flight." He looked at Holt. "Marshal." The sound of Holt being handcuffed was ordinary. Metal on bone. Click and click. He said nothing, which told Mei Lin more about him than anything he had said during the proceeding. He had known somewhere in the calculation of himself that this outcome was possible. She watched them walk him out. The room let out a collective breath. Several people who had been watching with skeptical faces were now watching with something more complicated, not quite respect, but the beginning of a renegotiation with their own assumptions. Mrs. Fong, standing against the wall, caught her eye and nodded once. Brisk and minimal, which was from Mrs. Fong a significant endorsement. Outside in the gray morning light, Ethan stood beside her on the boardwalk. He hadn't touched her since they'd left the courtroom, hadn't said anything, but the quality of his silence was different from his usual economy. It's not over, he said. The trial, I know. Sayers is going to come at this harder. He's going to bring in witnesses. He's going to pay in, Ethan. She turned to look at him. I know all of that. He stopped. I know it's going to be hard, she said. I know it's going to be ugly and unfair, and there are no guarantees. She held his gaze. But it's the right thing to do, and we're doing it together. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been learning, the one that lived somewhere between what he was thinking and what he was willing to say. Together, he said. Not a question. Together, she confirmed. The morning traffic of Redstone moved around them, horses and boots and voices, the ordinary business of a town proceeding without awareness of what had just shifted in one of its back rooms. Mei Lin stood on the boardwalk in the mountain cold and felt with some precision the exact location where her old life ended and whatever came next began. It was here. It was now. It was already different from anything she'd expected, and better in ways she hadn't had the imagination to anticipate. Mrs. Fong mentioned the boarding house has a room available through the trial, she said. She mentioned that to me too. Ethan glanced sideways at her. 2 rooms. Obviously. The ghost smile, closer to arriving this time. All right, he said. Let's go back. There are things we need to plan. They walked back through Redstone together, not touching, not performing anything, simply moving through the same space in the same direction at the same pace. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The trial lasted 4 days. Sayers had not been idle in the weeks between the hearing and the proceedings. He had assembled character witnesses, 3 men who swore Holt was a reliable guide, an upstanding member of the territory's business community, a 4th who claimed to have seen Mei Lin attempting to rob a merchant in San Francisco in 1876, a date she could easily disprove, given that she'd been in the employ of the laundry at the time and could produce the pay ledger to prove it. Dunbar had anticipated this and had sent a telegraph weeks prior. The ledger arrived by courier on the 2nd morning of the trial. Sayers pivoted without visible discomfort and tried a different approach. The courtroom was different from the hearing room, a proper public building with benches and a gallery that was full every day. Redstone had apparently decided, in the manner of small towns everywhere, that this was the most interesting thing to happen in recent memory, and attendance reflected that assessment. Mei Lin had learned to walk to her seat without looking at the gallery, to let its shifting atmosphere wash past her like weather. She testified for 3 hours on the 2nd day. Sayers came at her hard, and she answered every question with the same level precision she'd brought to the hearing, and when he suggested, carefully wrapped in a lawyerly conditional, that her relationship with Ethan Cole was transactional, that she had provided services in exchange for shelter and protection, and her accusations against Holt were designed to secure that arrangement permanently. She looked at him for a moment with an expression she had not planned and could not have suppressed. I was a laundry worker, she said. Then I was a woman left to die in the snow. Then I was a woman in a cabin trying not to die from an infected bone. I am now a woman who can set a trap, fire a rifle, and walk 12 miles through mountain snow on a leg that 4 months ago was broken in 3 places. She paused. Which part of that history is the service you're describing? The gallery made a sound that was difficult to interpret, and the judge rapped his gavel. Sayers moved on. On the 4th morning, the jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned with verdicts on all 3 counts. Guilty of theft. Guilty of criminal abandonment causing injury. Guilty of attempted murder. Sentencing was 15 years of hard labor for the murder attempt, the lesser counts running concurrent. Sayers announced his intention to appeal. The judge indicated that his intention was duly noted. Holt said nothing when the verdict was read. He sat with the stillness of a man calculating what came next, which told Mei Lin that he would always be the kind of man who calculated rather than the kind who felt. She didn't hate him for it. She understood the shape of it, even if she couldn't inhabit it. She had spent her whole life being read by people like Holt, people who looked at her and saw a calculation. She had survived it by being more complicated than they expected. Dunbar shook her hand outside the courthouse. It was a brief, firm handshake, the kind that meant something. "We're going to use your testimony in the investigation," he said. "The other case is the workers who went missing. This makes it possible to pursue those families, to give them answers." "Good," she said. "It'll take time." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I have time now." Mrs. Fong fed them that night a full meal, the first that hadn't been eaten, in the watchful uncertainty of the trial's duration. She sat with them herself, which she hadn't done before, and drank tea and talked about Redstone the way people talked about places they'd been watching for a long time, with the affection of someone who saw both its failures and its occasional grace clearly and had made peace with the proportion. "What are you going to do now?" she asked Mei Lin. "Go back to the cabin," Mei Lin said. "There's work to do before spring." Mrs. Fong looked at her with the same precise attention she brought to everything. "You're staying in the territory?" "Yes." "With him?" "Not a question." "We're building something together," Mei Lin said. "I'm not sure what to call it yet, but yes." Mrs. Fong looked at Ethan, who had been watching his coffee cup with the expression of a man pretending not to be listening. "She's going to be trouble," she said. "She already is," he said. "I've decided it's a net positive." Mrs. Fong made a sound that might have been a laugh compressed into a single syllable and released immediately. "Come back and see me in the spring," she said. "I'll have news for you about the new businesses coming in. There are people looking for workers who know how to work." "I'll keep that in mind," Mei Lin said. They rode back to the cabin in 2 days following the route now familiar to her, the creek, the ridge, the double-trunked pine that marked the edge of Ethan's trapline territory. The mountains were changing as winter loosened its grip. The snow surface softening in the hours around midday, the pines releasing their loaded branches in small avalanches that made the horse sidestep and snort. She noticed everything. She had started noticing everything somewhere during the weeks of recovery and had not stopped. The cabin looked smaller from outside than it felt from within. The new storage addition Ethan had framed and covered before the trial was waiting for its walls and roof, the skeletal timber standing against the softening sky. There was work here, real sustaining forward-moving work. She felt the shift in her chest when they came through the door, the recognition of something as home. She hadn't expected that. She had spent so long being a person in transit, a person to whom belonging was something other people had, that the feeling of it was almost disorienting in its warmth. She stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment and let it settle. Ethan was already moving firewater, the efficient reassembly of a life that had been paused rather than abandoned. He moved through the space with a quality she hadn't been able to name when she first arrived and could now comfort. Not contentment exactly, which required a stillness he wasn't built for. Something more active. The ease of a person in the right place. "The trap lines will need resetting," he said. "A month of reduced attention during the trial season." "I know. We should check the first 3 tomorrow." "Your leg is fine," she said. "Better than fine. I walked to town and back on it twice this week." He gave her the look he used when he was deciding between insisting and yielding, the internal argument brief and visible. He yielded. She had come to understand that this from Ethan was its own form of trust. "Tomorrow then," he said. They ate dinner at the table they'd shared for weeks now, and she talked about what Dunbar had told her regarding the investigation into the missing workers, the names being gathered, the letters sent to families in California, and farther afield, the slow and imperfect machinery of accountability beginning to turn. Ethan listened and asked precise questions and occasionally said something that reoriented her thinking on a detail she'd been approaching from the wrong direction. This was what they did. This was what they had built, not by design but by accumulation. Day added to day, conversation to conversation. The weight of shared experience pressing two separate structures gradually into alignment. After dinner, he sat with his carving. She read from the book Mrs. Fong had pressed into her hands on the morning of departure, a collection of frontier surveying journals that were both practically useful and, in their author's dry observations about landscape and weather, unexpectedly moving. "Ethan," she said at some point in the evening when the fire had settled to steadiness and the wind outside was low and the cabin had taken on the particular quality of nighttime peace. "Yeah, I want to file a formal homestead claim." He looked up from the carving. "I've been thinking about it since the trial," she said. "Dunbar said there are provisions not common but they exist for single women to file claims in the territory. It's not straightforward. There will be resistance. She met his eyes. But I want my own ground. Something I hold in my name. He was quiet for a moment. The carving knife turned slowly in his hands. The northern quarter of the ridge, he said, adjacent to mine. The timber and the creek access are better there anyway. She blinked. You have a quarter already filed. Filed for the adjacent parcel when I came back from the trial the first time, he said, before Dunbar even mentioned the provisions to you. He looked back at the carving. Figured you'd want it. She stared at him. You filed it before I asked. Seemed like the kind of decision you'd make eventually. He turned the carving in the firelight. A small bird she saw, now at its wings half open, caught in the moment before flight. Was I wrong? No, she said. You were exactly right. He set the bird on the shelf beside its predecessors. The horses, the pine cone he'd carved one slow evening, the small fish she had only recently connected to what she'd told him about her mother's pendant, and looked at it for a moment. There's still the pendant, she said quietly. Holt had it when they arrested him. Dunbar said it would be returned as evidence and eventually to me. I know, he looked at her. I thought about asking for it first, sending someone to retrieve it before the trial. Why didn't you? Because I thought maybe you should be the one to get it back. He paused. The returning of it matters. Who returns it matters. She felt something shift in her throat, the particular warmth of being understood precisely and without fuss. Thank you, she said. It was your mother's, he said. It was always going to come back to you. The fire crackled. Outside an owl called from the ridge, 3 notes, and then silence, and then 3 more. Ethan. She set down her book. Tell me something you haven't told me yet. He considered this with his usual seriousness, not deflecting or pretending not to understand the question. When you had the fever, he said finally, the 3rd night, you talked in your sleep. In Cantonese, I expect. Some of it, and some I could understand. He was watching the fire. You talked to your brother and your mother. She let that sit for a moment. What did I say to them? You kept telling them you were fine. His voice was soft. That they didn't need to worry. That you were somewhere safe. She pressed her lips together. The fire moved and the shadows moved with it. Were you listening? She said. I was sitting right there. Were you... She stopped and started again. Did you think it was true what I was saying? He turned from the fire and looked at her directly. I was working on making it true, he said. So yes, she had thought on the mountain road 4 months ago that she was dying. She had thought she understood dying, the slow, cold release, the fog, the quiet resignation. She had been wrong about what it was. She understood now, sitting in a warm cabin in the Montana Territory, with the smell of wood smoke and pine and coffee and the sounds of a man she had come to love, going quietly about his evening, that dying was not the fog or the cold or the resignation. Dying was the absence of this. She had been close enough to absent to know the difference. I want to plant a garden in the spring, she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know best of all, the one that was almost a smile that lived in the region just north of Warmth, that meant he was pleased by something and was deciding not to make a thing of it. Clara wanted a garden, he said. I know. She held his gaze. I want one too. Mine will be different from the one she would have planted. Different plants, different plan, different person. She paused. But I want you to help me build it. I want you to know that where you are is a place where things grow now. The moment that followed was the kind that didn't need filling. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand the way he had in the boarding house. Deliberate and unhurried, the gesture of someone who had decided to let himself want something and was trusting that decision. All right, he said, I'll help you with the garden. Outside, the Montana spring was still weeks away, cold air, snow on the high ridges, the season turning slowly. But in the cabin, the fire burned clean and the lamps threw warm light across the table, and the shelves and the small carved birds and fish and horses that stood in their rows like a record of evenings past in quiet usefulness. She had come to this territory running from something. She had found somewhere in the snow and the pain and the slow work of surviving that she had also been running toward something she just hadn't known what it was until she arrived. This was it. This man, this land, this life being built one day at a time from honest materials. She looked at the shelf where her mother's fish would eventually stand. She had already decided where it would go between the owl he'd carved last week and the pine cone from before the trial, and thought, I'm somewhere safe, Mama. You were right. The fish found its way home. The wind moved through the pines outside, easy and without threat. Inside, two people who had survived the worst the territory could offer sat across a table and held hands in the firelight, making plans for spring.